I'm going to be telling you the real reason why Cubans got rich in Miami. You may have heard, of course, that most of the money in Florida comes from illicit activities like importing things from Colombia. I'm going to tell you the truth about how Cubans and Miami in general as a city got to be a lot richer than many other places. And the answer is not what you think. There are two components to why Miami got to be a really wealthy city. Number one is population density. New York, San Francisco, Miami have the highest population density. However, Miami's population density is all in new construction because San Francisco and New York are older cities, and other cities like Boston, Chicago that are older and have high population densities, the people are being housed in older structures. That means that companies like Walmart and other companies that like low-income workers, basically companies that like to exploit people, are not really able to do it on the same scale simply because the square footage of real estate makes places like Walmart really stay out of business in a place like Miami. There just isn't enough square footage for the types of operations those company runs, and that leaves a vacancy available for small businesses. But there's more, you see, because places in South Florida like Lehigh Acres right now are a perfect example of what Miami was in the 70s and 80s. It's starting to become a urban Hispanic area when it used to be a rural native area. Like Lehigh Acres, for example, where you have the locals, most of them have moved out as it becomes a more urban area. But those areas where Hispanic communities migrate into in South Florida eventually get absolutely no investment. We're talking no large corporations move in. There just isn't anything there other than single family home construction. And even though we saw what happened in Hialeah, Florida, where it just became one giant area of nothing but single family homes with kind of not too much investment. There's no large shopping centers in Hialeah. There's a mall, there's a few shopping centers, but it really isn't on the scale a place with 200,000 people should have. And despite the fact you saw that happen in Hialeah, which is the most Cuban city in America, with about 94% of the population being Hispanic, most of them being Cuban, with some Colombians, the same thing that happened in Hialeah is now taking place in Lehigh Acres and in Cape Coral. What happens is that for the most part, a lot of corporations give you a perfect example. Starbucks, they don't want to invest in minority communities. Places like Starbucks or Publix only want to put their stores in white, high-income areas, leaving Black communities and Hispanic communities completely out of the economical realm. But we have seen in the United States how racism has backfired. For example, now in the United States, after decades of police profiling, we've seen that the white population, which was mostly being overlooked by law enforcement, now has addiction and overdose death rates up to 2 times higher than the Hispanic or the Black population, which means that many times racism has backfired in what was once police discrimination or economical discrimination. These things actually, in the long run, produce great opportunities for the communities that are being discriminated. Police profiling led to Hispanics and Blacks knowing that they couldn't really have anything illicit on them. The reason that places like Bradenton, Sarasota have so many overdoses is because of the doctors here. The doctors are the ones that create the problem, and Blacks and Hispanics do not have access to the same medical care. Analytically, we have seen how Hispanics have lower incomes, Blacks have lower incomes, Blacks and Hispanic communities have less infrastructure, have less investment, and all those things create initially an economical advantage for the population that's not being discriminated. However, over the long term, a lot of problems do come with that growth. A lot of problems do come with that investment. A lot of problems do come with that good healthcare. And basically, the deprivation of access to healthcare and investments in the Hispanic and Black community has actually led to today those communities starting to have better analytics than the white population, for the simple fact that, for one, doctors are not able to get their hands on those people. Places that have large Hispanic populations: Miami, El Paso, San Antonio, San Jose, California, is places that have the largest percentage of foreign-born population, are also places that have the lowest percentages of drug overdose deaths. And this isn't my opinion, you can look this up. If you were actually to Google the cities with the highest immigrant populations and the cities with the lowest overdose deaths, those lists overlap fairly well, which means that the drug crisis that is destroying America, with over 100,000 Americans dying from overdoses every single year, is predominantly affecting, that's right, the white population. But the white population has been systematically ensuring that Hispanics and blacks do not get access to healthcare, infrastructure, and other things that have facilitated that problem. So as we can see, racism really does backfire. And the reason a place like Miami has been able to be so successful is because it's been discriminated economically, and it's allowed place, for one, no influx of the things that are destroying America. Two, no doctors, no healthcare. And three, it's just prepared this population to not be part of the economical system, because real economical success doesn't come from working for Walmart, it comes from being self-employed. But when you talk about Miami and the Cuban community, there's another aspect that a lot of people fail to overlook. Cubans are coming from a communist regime, and a lot of people were not fleeing communism, they were fleeing an oppressive regime. A lot of people do not understand in the United States what communism is, because there's been so much propaganda about communism. Americans think that California is communism. Let me tell you that California is absolutely the least communist place in the United States. For one, it's the most expensive place. That's the most capitalistic thing you could absolutely do. Number two, it's a state where people have to work up to 3 jobs to pay for a building to live in. That right there is absolutely the most capitalistic thing you could ever do. And in reality, the states in the United States that actually are closest to communism are states like West Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where real estate is worth nothing, and many times the government is giving you housing. If you go to a small town in Alabama, you'll notice how there's so much government public housing. The projects, the bricks. Yes, that, the government giving you a place to live for free or very subsidized, is more along the lines of communism. Where in California, it's so expensive, that's a capitalistic model. That's not a communist model. A communist model is a place like Alabama, Mississippi, and West Virginia, where a large percentage of the population receives food stamps. A large percentage of the population has government housing. A large percentage of the population, you can buy a house in Montgomery or Jackson, Mississippi for $30,000 that's inhabitable. That is more along the lines of communism than California, where a single family home is worth roughly about $1 million. I was born in Cuba, and I actually know what communism is. And what a lot of people fail to recall when they say communism, is that communism is mostly going to be related to a dictatorship, a totalitarian regime, and those regimes usually come from a revolt against the government, which recently the United States was involved in. If you didn't know that, we actually were this close to becoming a communist regime in the United States, because for the most part, people always say communism, communism, but they forget one word: regime, oppression. Those words, it's just about what almost happened in the United States recently. And Americans, despite their hate for communism, do not realize how close America recently came to becoming a freaking dictatorship. Because the first thing that any communist does is first overthrow a government. That is where communism comes into play. Second, completely silencing anybody who's opposed to you. That is an aspect of communism. But there's another aspect of communism, and the reason I'm mentioning it in today's video that makes it relevant to today's conversation is that communism does one single particular thing. It eliminates private business, and the government itself installs your job. Your livelihood comes directly from the government. And how does that lead to Miami becoming a wealthy city, you may ask? Now you have, 3 generations of Cubans that lived under communism. Their job comes directly from the government. If you have a government-issued vehicle and you are starving, you will literally take the wheels off that vehicle and sell it and replace it with older wheels because you're starving and you have nothing and you're working for a government that's not paying you enough. So example, here in the United States, if I have an F-150 or a Peterbilt pickup semi-truck and I paid for it, I'm going to take care of that truck. I'm going to change the oil, going to clean it, I'm going to put new tires on it. In the case of Cuba, they do have a lot of infrastructure. The government has Peterbilt trucks. They have F-150s, just like they do here in the United States. From Brazil and Mexico, they've been able to import a lot of American trucks, F-150s, Peterbilt International, every single American brand. The government has that infrastructure. Cuba's infrastructure, as far as access to transportation, is about the same as the United States or any other country. Not for the regular Cuban, but for the government. So let's say you have a semi-truck, or let's say you have a F-150 in your driveway, and that F-150 belongs to the government. And you are getting paid $20 a month. Chances are, if there are brand new tires on that F-150, they're going to disappear, swapped out very soon. If there's new oil in that F-150, you're going to drain out that new oil and sell it to somebody who has a private vehicle and grab the old oil and put it into that F-150. And systematically, Cubans have just learned from communism to steal every dollar they can. Crap, you've seen in Miami how people will rent a U-Haul truck and swap the engine. If it's the same engine as their car. This has been happening in Miami. There's actually viral photos of people doing this in Miami, where they'll rent a U-Haul or they'll rent a car, and if the engine is the same as the one in their car, they'll swap the engine overnight. Those are the techniques that people have learned from Cuba and communism on how to pull a dollar from a place where it really doesn't exist. We've heard big companies like Amazon talking about moving to Miami. That is a horrible idea, and let me tell you why. Cubans, like I said, have learned that their job isn't a place you go to make an income. Americans have a lot of loyalty for the company they work for. I've met Americans who work at Wendy's and they won't eat at McDonald's, even though Wendy's is exploiting them. Even the American TV show King of the Hill, we saw the cartoon character Hank. He works for a propane company. The boss is a jerk. Guy cares nothing about his employees. He's just a bigwig, Mongol trying to get rich off his employees. Yet we see how in that TV show, Hank Hill is portrayed as being loyal to a company that doesn't care about him. In fact, Hank Hill at home refuses to use charcoal because he sells propane. If you don't know who I'm referring to, King of the Hill is one of the greatest American TV shows that portrays the actual mentality of Americans. It's a great TV series. Growing up as a kid, I didn't think it was interesting, but now as an adult, I think King of the Hill is a masterpiece of American television. And we can see in the character of Hank Hill how he refuses to use charcoal in his home or even anything that resembles a charcoal product because he works for a propane company. Even though the company does not have his best interests at heart, Americans are just genuinely loyal to wherever they're getting their income from. But coming from communism in Miami, people have a complete opposite mentality. They see their job, which in Cuba comes directly from the government, as a complete freaking oppressor. And while Cubans like the system of capitalism for entrepreneurship, being self-employed, Cubans understand that working for somebody else simply isn't the answer. And in Miami, that is a mentality that a lot of people have. Cubans believe in the American dream as entrepreneurs. They do not believe in the American dream as going to work for a company. Crap, if you've seen the movie Scarface, you completely understand the mentality that Cubans have when they come to the United States, that they are not going to be exploited by somebody else. We've seen Scarface. Hey, I'm not washing dishes. I didn't come to America to wash dishes. And that really is the mentality of a lot of Cubans. We didn't come to America to work at a Walmart or to be a dishwasher. We came here to be entrepreneurs, because in the minds of Cubans working for the government in Cuba, the true definition of the American dream isn't working for a company and retiring with that company. It's you being the company. It's you being the boss. And when they arrive to the United States and find the opportunity for self-employment, it doesn't matter how difficult it makes it, doesn't matter how much racism, discrimination, excessive permitting. One thing that's happening in South Florida systematically to Cubans, and it's still happening to this day in a lot of the rural counties like Highlands, DeSoto, a lot of these rural counties in South Florida, Hardy County, is that when Hispanics, minorities go to pull a permit for a business, the inspectors require more from them than from other people. They're constantly getting inspected. They're constantly being, discriminated by these local authorities that are really being discriminatory. However, the vast majority of the time when Hispanics are being discriminated, they think that's just the way business works. They don't recognize that it's coming from a point of oppression, to the point that it's programmed Hispanics to be racist against Hispanics, not because they don't like Hispanics, because they just think that that's the American way of doing business. And now a lot of Hispanics are actually doing racist tactics on other Hispanics, not knowing it's coming from a place of oppression from racism and Anglo-Saxon, and how they view Hispanic and just any immigrant. They actually think this is the way you treat people in American business. And many of the practices that racist people have done to Hispanics, now Hispanics just go around doing it to everybody else and their own people, not realizing that it's coming from a place originally of hate because of the passive-aggressive nature of racism in the United States, which most people that are native from here understand, but most people that are immigrants, they don't get the picture. Passive aggression simply does not register in the minds of Hispanics, especially those coming from communist oppressive regimes, because aggressive communist regimes will quite literally beat you upside the head with a machete in the middle of the street. There's no reason to beat around the bush if somebody doesn't like you. So these passive aggressive behaviors that are displayed in the business atmosphere coming from a place of racism are usually completely misinterpreted, not understood, and missing their point. But what it does is it just prepares and refines people to be better, like I've said earlier in the video. The reason you definitely do not want to have a manufacturing plant in a place like Miami, the knowledge, skills that you teach your employees in a place like, let's say, rural Alabama, crap, they make cars in Alabama. It doesn't really take a genius to make a vehicle. I don't know, one of the most complicated pieces of equipment in the world is a vehicle. They have freaking people in Alabama making cars, if you didn't know this. And it's not in the smartest parts of Alabama, it's in the absolute dumbest places. Montgomery, Alabama makes freaking Kias. And what's crazy is they're not exactly looking for the highest educated, brightest people to sell these cars. Yes, but to make them, absolutely not. It doesn't really take a genius to do manufacturing work. It just takes teaching somebody repetitively to do the same thing over and over. And that's what dumb people are best at. If they put that Kia plant, they put that Toyota plant in a place like Miami or San Francisco or New York, the first thing that would happen is that those people that are working would learn how to do what they're doing, and they'd figure out to do it for themselves. That's why large corporations will never teach one employee everything there is to know. They may have 10 or 100 employees and teach 100 or 10 people exactly what they need to know, and no one employee will know every aspect of that company, because if one employee were to know how to do that, All he would need is a private investor. He can start doing it himself. But the problem arises, coming from a communist regime, everybody there in that company that you've hired in Miami has the same goal. It's not to work for you, it's to have their own company. And what's been happening in Miami, and they'll do it to anybody, small company, big company, you have 4 employees or maybe even 10. You've hired 10 employees and now you have a manufacturing company in Miami making something as simple as this. Who the crap knows? It may be something more complicated. It could be hurricane shutters. It could be portable buildings. It could be just anything. You're manufacturing something in Miami. A lot of things are manufactured in Miami if you didn't know this. Miami actually has a huge manufacturing scene, and a lot of it is because people have just been replicating other people's business models to perfection. I've worked for companies in Naples that originally started in Miami, and the person who started this company was simply an employee for this company, saw how they did everything, duplicated it, started their own business. So here's how this works, and this is the key. This is the key to why Miami got so freaking rich and why those Cubans have $5 million houses in Homestead when the average American retiring can't afford it. Here's a company, you have 10 employees, and you have 10 pieces of equipment in a manufacturing process, or each employee has 10 different applications. Those employees are all going to go and run your business. They're learning how to run these equipments, they're learning who your suppliers are, they're learning the cost of the materials, but you think that these 10 employees are all working against each other. In fact, the American system is to pin employees up against each other. But in Miami, that doesn't happen because Cubans are a community, and in the workplace, if there's 7 Cubans and 3 Mexicans, they're gonna push those 3 Mexicans out. They want that whole thing themselves. Cubans are very possessive of workplaces to the point where a lot of large corporations, when they set up business in Miami, the business functions, okay, here's a big corporation, I don't know, Starbucks or a warehouse or a furniture store, somebody, we're gonna set up here in Miami. Right now, we're setting up a business. Usually, if we're setting this up in Nashville, or we're setting this up in Memphis, we're able to go in there and micromanage this company. The problem in Miami is that you're gonna set up this business and they're gonna feed you back your revenue, but you're not gonna be able to micromanage it the same way you do in Tennessee. They're gonna run their own program. And that right there is why a lot of large corporations simply do not like to do business in Florida, because a lot of times they're not able to get the same loyalty. That's why right now they're trying to grab employees. Why do you think they're trying to get people to move to Miami? Have you ever thought about that? Why do they want to bring people from other places to Miami? Because they cannot depend on the local workforce, because that local workforce is a freaking beast. So what happens in Miami is that despite that there's a local workforce available, the companies do not want to use that local workforce. They want to bring in their own employees, because this local workforce over here isn't going to be exploited the same way that they are in other places. Conservative America, let's say you go to a small town in Kentucky, for example, and let's say here's a city bus or a private bus, right? There's a city bus, maybe it's a private contract, and they run over a citizen, okay? And now this citizen is going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. When you go to that courtroom in a small town in Kentucky, the people in that jury are most likely gonna take sides with the bus, whether it's the city bus or it's a private company, than they are with the citizen that got ran over by that bus. Because Americans, again, are more loyal to corporations than they are to other people. Reverse the scripts. In New York City, for example, if a city bus were to hit a pedestrian, this pedestrian and his family would get millions upon millions of dollars. Because in New York City, the people in general in that jury are going to care more about that person, and very little thought is going to be given to that big corporation, which is why I want you guys to understand that it's not places like New York City or California that are communist. It's actually small town America that has more of a communist mentality of protecting the interests of businesses and government versus the interests of people. And that may sound confusing to you as an American because you've been told the complete opposite. But again, who would know communism more than me, a Cuban American who grew up in Cuba was born in Cuba but grew up in the United States. I've seen both sides of that world. And while Americans don't know this, a lot of places like New York City and Los Angeles, these big cities, the mentality of people is as far from communism as it gets. It's actually small town America that more likely resembles what a real communist regime is like. But again, the reason we're having this conversation isn't because of politics. I'm having this conversation because I want you guys to understand exactly why and how a place like Miami has become so wealthy. Of course, everything you've heard comes from a racist, anti-Hispanic perspective, or a movie like Scarface, which just wants to depict Hispanics as these just dealing, like there's no way they want to accept that the reason Hispanics in Miami as a whole got so wealthy is because of the entrepreneur spirit of the people. They want you to think it's been done illicitly, but in reality, it hasn't. It's pure brain, and it's pure the way people are programmed to think based on where they're coming from. Let's go back to that company we talked about. So you have your 10 employees, and now these 10 employees, let's say there's a piece of equipment that's outdated. It's not the new one, okay? So the company now decides that they're gonna get rid of this $10 million piece of equipment, okay? It's a $10 million piece of equipment, but it's outdated, okay? Now, those employees are gonna be in charge of getting rid of that equipment, but that equipment isn't gonna go to a scrapyard. It's gonna go to somebody's garage or warehouse. See, these employees, maybe not all of them, 2 or 3 of them flipped. And they understand, hey man, we're gonna learn. Let's say you're manufacturing just for the sake of things, it's this, but it's really not. Let's pretend this is not a tape measure. Let's pretend this is like a freaking, I don't know, a more expensive thing, okay? This product that we're producing, 2 or 3 of those people flip and they're like, hey dude, you know this, I know that. We are actually getting our hands on some of this really expensive equipment because the company now, they're moving on to this new expensive equipment. They're replacing their old equipment. This equipment's worth millions of dollars, but we're not gonna get rid of it. We're gonna save that. So now, these employees, you weren't able to flip all of them, but the 2 or 3 that weren't able to flip, now you have a workplace where everybody's family, everybody's queuing, everybody's sprouting in the community. They actually get new employees now, and these new employees are actually planted employees. They're friends of the 2 or 3 over here that are got together. 2 or 3 got together, they couldn't flip everybody on this whole thing, but now they're gonna get new employees, and those new employees are recommended by the current employees because you as a boss, you've been like, hey man, you're a good employee, bring me your friends. So now the entire workforce, next thing you know, they get rid of the ones that weren't cooperating, and now everybody on this team are all friends, they're all from the same hometown, and they all have the same idea to learn how to do what you're doing. So you're paying Juan over here $15 an hour to manage this equipment. You never wanted to give him a raise, you never wanted to pay him more. Now, Juan over here knows how to work this equipment, and Juan over here and his buddies already have the equipment sitting in the garage. Eventually, all those workers are gonna walk out on you when they find somebody that has the investment, and somebody will come along, and it may be dirty money. It may be somebody that has dirty money, but the person that has dirty money says, hey man, I'm gonna give you $2 or $3 million that I'm trying to launder to get this company started. It's a legitimate company, and everybody involved in the company is actually legitimate. It's just the funding itself originally came from somebody who's an investor. Now, these people copied your business model, took some of your equipment from you, took your employees, took all the knowledge, and they ran off and they made their own freaking company. And that right there, people, is exactly what has happened systematically in Miami. That anybody that starts a company there, people just sit back, watch your business model, copy it, and plant employees to learn exactly every little detail of the business. Next thing you know, they run off and they start their own manufacturing company. And what's happened in Miami, instead of there being one giant Walmart, you have 10 mom and pop places. And instead of one giant manufacturing company expanding and getting hundreds more than thousands of employees, they rip off their model, and now there's 2 manufacturing companies. And guess what? They may know a more effective way to make that company work because, again, It's always the people who are hands-on that know how to make things happen. And really, the reason Miami has been so successful is because they've been able to simply systematically weed out these big corporations, rip off their business ideas, do it themselves, and become millionaires. And that right there, guys, is how Miami became so wealthy. And that's why anybody who goes to Miami to start a big company, in the long term, is gonna freaking regret it, because the people there have the whole thing rigged up. They know how to make it work. They know how to make it function. And that is why Miami has become so wealthy. Now, if you look at analytics, it doesn't look great for the vast majority, but a lot of those Cubans, they figured out. They came here to be the boss, not to be the employee.